4 times. That's the number of instances on which this character was referenced directly across 371 chapters and 16 prequel episodes, and yet his presence looms large over the entire story. In an interview given in 1996, Kentaro Miura stated that Berserk is actually a 1,000-year-long story. And this guy is primarily the reason for that, in our opinion. The first time we hear his name, we are traveling down a literal monument dedicated to covering up his legacy. But as the story progresses, it becomes apparent that things are not as simple as they seem to have been interpreted as. If you've seen our Skull Knight video, you'll know what we think happened to him after his life as a human came to an end. But this video is going to be exactly about that life. So without further ado, this is Supreme King Gaiseric's origins explored. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. But first, a short history lesson. The real-life Vandal legend named Gaiseric. Many things in Kentaro Miura's creation mirror real-life superstitions and religious beliefs, but only 2 characters have been directly named after historical figures. The first is the great emperor of the Kushan Empire, Ganishka, who was heavily inspired from the real-life King Kanishka, mostly just a name. Berserk's Kushan are a race of conquerors who leave a bloody trail in their wakes and will enslave you if you can still walk after a battle, quite unlike the real-life Kanishka, who was a central part of the spread of Buddhism and believed to be quite a spiritual and benevolent reader. You can find out more about that comparison from our Ganishka origins video, which is also on our channel, but the point is, Ganishka is the second Miura creation to refer to real life explicitly. The first is Gaiseric. In world history, Gaiseric was the legendary ruler of the Vandal kingdom who managed to not only hoodwink the Western Roman Empire out of their most important North African power center, but went on to become one of the 4 leaders who sacked Rome itself. The illegitimate son of the previous king Godigicel and a slave woman, Gaiseric rose to power after both his father and half-brother died. The historian Jordanes noticed that Gaiseric was a man of few words, but one who always focused on winning, exceptional at sowing seeds of dissent, and a shrewd politician and military commander, despite having a lame leg due to falling off of horseback at one point in his life. He was able to defend his people from a Swabi invasion in the Battle of Merida, fought in 428, and took all his people across the Mediterranean, establishing the Vandal kingdom on the northern coastline of Africa. Gaiseric's capture of Hippo Regius and subsequent advance on Carthage forced the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III to sign a peace treaty with the Vandal king and seal the recognition of his right to rule with a marriage pact between their children. Gaiseric went on to capture Carthage anyways a few years later, but it was when Valentinian was usurped by Petronius Maximus that the Vandal king got his opportunity to really hit the empire in its proverbial crown jewel, and that was Rome. See, Petronius secured his usurpation by not only bribing the entire Senate and getting Valentinian assassinated, but also took his wife and had his daughter marry his own son to ensure there would be no opposition to his rule. This turned out to be a stupid mistake because Valentinian's daughter was betrothed to Gaiseric's son Huneric, and this breach of a formal treaty rendered the peace between the Vandals and the Western Roman Empire dead in the water as far as he was concerned. On top of that, Valentinian's wife really did not like the fact that Petronius had her husband killed and forced her to marry him, and so she sent word to Gaiseric for aid. Though the Vandals had already begun invading the empire's holdings elsewhere, Petronius's treachery allowed them to declare all-out war. Rome was thoroughly sacked in the year 455. And although varying accounts exist as to what transpired during this time, one thing is known beyond the shadow of a doubt. The Romans learned the meaning of the term vandalism firsthand that fortnight. It is said that the Vandals were so thorough with their sacking of Rome that they even took the precious metals off of roofing in the city, and left with far more loot than the Visigoths did when they sacked Rome for the second time in the empire's history. For the rest of his life, the king managed to repel attacks from both the Western and the Eastern Roman empires, managing to deal devastating losses to both sides as he consolidated his power over the Straits of Gibraltar and expanded Vandal authority on both sides of the Mediterranean. Following Gaiseric's death, his son Huneric could not fill his father's shoes as a shrewd and ruthless leader during a time when the political system was nothing more than a pit of vipers. but the Vandal King's legacy is as impressive as it is bloody. Though the king himself might have been lame, his people were more than active at shedding blood and taking slaves, which was just what the norm of the day was. In the end, Gaiseric's security for the Vandal peoples came at the cost of many lives, even if those lives were filthy Roman aristocrats, but it's that last part that's important for our story. Because it appears as though Kentaro Miura has taken certain aspects of the original Gaiseric and fine-tuned them to create a foundational legend in his story, whose existence and identity are still debated within the community. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the mysterious Supreme King Gaiseric. He's brought up 4 times, but each time is more significant than the last. The fairy/real tale of the Skull King Gaiseric. The first time Gaiseric is mentioned is in chapter 53, when Princess Charlotte leads Guts' party down the Tower of Rebirth during their mission to rescue Griffith. Guts asks the princess what was up with the tower in the first place, given how much it looked more and more like a torture chamber the deeper they went. Charlotte explains that the prison, built after the time of the Inquisitions, went down no deeper than the height of the tower above ground. But the hole itself was deeper than any mountain in Midland, and its origins lie in the creation of the kingdom itself. She asks the party if they knew how Midland came to be in the first place, and when they gave her the obvious denial, she broke into a history lesson about the dark past of her kingdom and family. 1,000 years ago, the continent of man was fragmented into several smaller city-states and rival tribes that were constantly in conflict with each other. She called it the Age of Warlords, and it feels appropriate because our own world history is drenched in the blood of countless nameless soldiers who died fighting for a cause. Continuous warfare did not mean endless glory, however, for war is the bringer of many other ills apart from death on the battlefield and the destruction of property, human or otherwise. Famine and plague ate away 1/3 of the entire continent's population, and Guts remarks that that isn't so different from the state of the world today, commenting that humans had made no progress. But Charlotte states otherwise and claims that the fighting was finally ended by one man who managed to unify the entire continent of man under his absolute rule. He's the only person in history to have accomplished this mammoth task, and he did so coming from absolute anonymity. No one knew his name before he appeared on the world stage or where he came from, but when he arrived and took all of mankind for his subjects by the sword, he came to be known as Supreme King Gaiseric. Guts thinks to himself that Gaiseric's story sounds like Griffith's, but Charlotte's words prove the two were nothing alike. Griffith, while a strong fighter in his own right, has never been a savage on the battlefield. He is a calculating fighter who knows how to end things with one slash of his sword if need be, quite like Serpico in fact, who turned Guts' size advantage against him in St. Albion. Princess Charlotte states that because of his merciless fighting style, Gaiseric came to be known as the Demon King, or the King of Galloping Death by his enemies. But there was another reason why he was remembered as such a dreaded figure. Whenever Gaiseric went into battle, he would don a helmet that resembled the human skull, which makes Guts immediately think about the mysterious Skull Knight he met in chapter 37 who warned him of his impending doom. If you want to know why this is important, we suggest you go check out our Skull Knight Origins video, and then come back to this one right here. But let's keep things moving. This is when Judo chimes in and brings up a third variant of the same story, known as the fairy tale of the Skull King. Apparently, after securing his kingdom, Gaiseric had a massive capital city constructed in the middle of all lands, which is how the kingdom of Midland got its current name. He worked thousands upon thousands of workers to their death, and levied exorbitant taxes from his citizens to support his own lavish lifestyle. In the latter years of Gaiseric's reign, his capital city became known as a den of feasting and pleasure, and then finally, his sins hit critical mass one day, and God sent down 5 angels to destroy the Skull King's city. Through natural calamities, the biggest city in the known world was drowned beneath the earth in a single night, thus giving birth to the fairy tale. Casca disputes the number of angels and says that there were 4 angels, which throws Judo for a loop, but Charlotte confirms that the city at least did exist. In fact, it still does, at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth, untouched by sunlight or time. Many investigative teams had been sent into the whole of Midland's heritage, but none had returned to tell their tales, and, as if to show us why, at that moment, Casca's torch falls into the abyss. As Miura traces its trajectory, we see glimpses of classical sculptures and buildings that are reminiscent of the architecture and art propagated by the real-life Gaiseric's kingdom. And when the torch hits the bottom in front of the ruins of a pantheon-like structure, it illuminates several rotting corpses that can either belong to the aforementioned investigative teams, or worse yet, Gaiseric's ancient kingdom. Because every corpse lying at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth had a brand of sacrifice etched into its forehead, and in hindsight, that should have been our first hint that this rescue mission wasn't going to go exactly as planned. The next time we hear Gaiseric's name mentioned is a full 85 chapters later, and it is brought up by a most peculiar character. After performing his daily routine of 1,000 prostrations in the morning, Father Mozgus tells the commander of the Holy Iron Chain Knights, Farnese Dan Vendimion, the history of the Tower of Conviction. He says that in ancient times, Supreme King Gaiseric had imprisoned a certain sage in this tower. That sage, presumably captured after Gaiseric had erected his capital city and turned it into a capital of debauchery, proclaimed the Supreme King's many sins to God daily in the midst of every possible torture. But in time, an angel was made to descend to answer his calls, which we're guessing coincided with the fall of Gaiseric's kingdom. If you want to know who we think that sage might have been, check out our Void Origins video. But this assessment does make sense because if Gaiseric's kingdom included all of Midland as his capital city, then the Tower of Conviction would have been a part of it. It's possible that after the fall of the city itself, the outlying structures, like this tower, which is located in St. Albion, far from Windham, were able to survive the collapse. But after this small reference to the Supreme King, his name vanishes from the pages of Berserk for over 200 chapters, being brought back up with respect to the Falcon of Light's new capital city of Falconia. Guru Gedfring, one of the archmages of Elfhelm, reveals that Falconia is in fact Gaiseric's city raised from the depths within which it resided lightless for a millennium. We can corroborate this fact by checking out Miura's breathtaking illustrations of Griffith's utopian capital. Sure enough, there is a Colosseum and many other classic structures that match the architectural tone of the debris we saw at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth in Chapter 53. Up until this point, it had only been speculation that Falconia was Gaiseric's old city come again, quite literally, but Gedfring's statements seem to have cleared up that confusion. And the final time that Gaiseric's name was brought up in the story was in Chapter 358. 13 chapters after Guru Gedfring revealed the re-emergence of Gaiseric's capital, and within its very walls by the very man who had raised it from the astral world. In Falconia, as Griffith holds a council meeting with his advisors, it becomes clear that the consequences of the emergence of Fantasia are not as light as they were made to seem so far. Sure, the Band of the Falcon had citizen protection on lock, but everything else was in shambles, particularly the economy, which was pretty much non-existent at this point. Plus, the city had a growing refugee problem, and though Falconia was the only safe haven for humanity in Fantasia, it was not quite the utopia all believed it to be. Crime was steadily increasing in the city, and so were the orphans, and food shortages, and, well, you can imagine the rest. In the midst of all this chaos and disarray, however, Griffith replies that the only way to keep Falconia thriving was to allow its citizens to prosper. He proposed sweeping educational and military reforms, gave his backing to a proposal made by Charlotte for creating an orphanage, and declared that moving forward with the intent of prospering was the only way to ensure humanity's survival. Griffith said that every inch of land that the Band of the Falcon reclaimed was more living space for humanity itself, and then made his most ambitious proposal so far. Griffith viewed Fantasia not as a feeding ground for terrifying entities, but as an empty map for him to fill up. Then, he invoked Gaiseric's name directly and brought up the fact that the former Windham, the current site of Falconia, once lied at the heart of the Supreme King's continent-wide empire. If one man could accomplish such a mammoth task, then they should aspire to it with boundless ambition. Griffith declared his intent to establish humanity's realm, a second continental empire, and because of his ascended status, his counselors actually rushed off to start thinking of ways that they could help realize his vision. So far, this is the final mention of the man whose 1,000-year legacy continues to shape the story of Berserk. But who exactly was he? Well, let's investigate the possibilities. A warrior whose history might have been clouded on purpose. King Gaiseric's possible origins. After watching our Skull Knight and Void videos, you guys must have a concrete idea of what we think happened that turned the former Skull King into the Skull Knight. But here's what we think happened before all that transpired. Assuming that the Skull Knight is King Gaiseric, which we are for all of our videos, the three people who can help us understand Gaiseric's true past are Flora, Danon, and Puck. Yeah, you heard us right, Puck. Also, we'll be referring to the Holy See scriptures at one point in time because one of their foundational prophecies is directly linked to Gaiseric's capital city. Now, as we've mentioned earlier in this video, Kentaro Miura once called Berserk a 1,000-year-old story. This was when he was just beginning the Conviction arc, and Gaiseric had only been mentioned once in the story, but collecting everything we've gathered so far gives rise to an interesting picture. When Charlotte states how Gaiseric emerged on the world stage, Guts immediately thinks of Griffith, given how similar their life stories sounded. But we'd say that there was nothing similar about their life stories based on the simple fact that Gaiseric lived at a time when the world was in a state of fantasia, whereas Griffith brought it back to that state. Through the interactions that Guts and his party members have with Sierke and Flora, we can deduce that the downfall of Gaiseric's kingdom coincided with the rise of the Holy See and the decline of belief in magic in the world. In fact, we experience firsthand how opening your eyes to the world's truths can show you the existence of spirits and such with Farnes. So, if magic coexisted with humanity back in those days, it is not an exaggeration to think that Gaiseric was someone with close ties to it. Flora calling him a dear old friend is proof of this statement, and so is a certain flashback from chapter 362, but we'll get to that in a bit. As for why Gaiseric was not known before his arrival on the world stage, there can be two reasons for it. The first reason could be that he was someone like Griffith, an unrecognized child who built himself up through sheer ambition. Like Griffith, Gaiseric's dazzling vision attracted thousands to his banner, and his battle exploits reinforced their faith in him. The second reason could be that Gaiseric came from a place that wasn't exactly present on the maps of the world. If you've read the manga, you know where we're going with this. But let's pivot to a prophecy for a hot minute and establish the connection between Gaiseric and the Holy See. Apart from the alleged torture of a sage in the Tower of Conviction, the only other mention of the Skull King's legacy is in the prophecy of the Falcon of Darkness. This prophecy states that when the sun dies 5 times, a red lake shall appear west of a city with a name both old and new. It is proof that the 5th angel will alight. He is the Falcon of Darkness, the master of sinful black sheep, and the king of the blind white sheep, and the harbinger of the age of darkness. This prophecy is a twofold barrage of truth, one of the only times that such a thing happens in Berserk. The first truth is with regards to the nature of Griffith following his ascension and incarnation. The prophecy correctly identifies Griffith/Femto as the Falcon of Darkness and the bringer of the Age of Darkness. Void's post-eclipse speech confirms this assumption. The second truth is with regards to the history of Midland itself, as the prophecy confirms the existence of Gaiseric's kingdom. A city with a name both old and new is a clear reference to Windham, which used to be the center of Gaiseric's capital city. We know this because the Tower of Rebirth is in Windham, where the remains of said city are said to lie slumbering into an eternal sleep. Another affirmation lies in the old and new name statement, which we believe actually references all of Midland itself. While it is a kingdom in the current timeline, 1,000 years ago it was the name of the capital of Gaiseric's kingdom which spanned the entire continent. This logic is in alignment with Princess Charlotte's history lessons, which we became privy to in chapter 53. So, at the very least, we can safely assume that whoever was behind the formation of the Holy See had a clear idea of causality and such, as there is no other way they could have predicted Femto's birth, and back in those days, perceiving causality must have been easier due to the prevalence of magic. And this is where chapter 362 comes in, because it pretty much blows open the doors to Gaiseric's identity in our opinion. In that chapter, we get to witness, alongside Guts, the blood memory of the Skull Knight right before the Berserker armor consumed every drop of blood from his body and killed him. In it, he stands in an interstice that looks unlike anything we've seen in the series, which appears like a simultaneous eclipse and incarnation ceremony seemingly for the birth of Void. The man wearing the armor looks at the face of a woman dying in his arms, who has the brand of sacrifice on her shoulders right before Guts is brought back to the present. But this is the key we've been looking for this entire time. That woman is called the Lady Priestess of the Cherry Blossoms, a former denizen of Elfhelm, the former lover of the Skull Knight in his human life, and the teacher of Flora the Mage, who taught Shirke instead. The Lady Priestess must have been an incredibly powerful magic user in real life, because Flora herself is capable of performing miraculous feats in the final days of her life. But if she was Gaiseric's lover, then it means that Gaiseric must have been aware of the world of magic at that time. And more than that, we think that he used this knowledge to aid his conquest. Recall that the Supreme King received his nickname specifically due to his ruthless and merciless fighting style on the field of battle. Where else have we seen that in Berserk? Oh, that's right, when Guts allows himself to be taken over by the Berserker armor. When Guts visits the dwarven creator of the Berserker armor, Hanar, he is informed that he has not fully mastered its use so far. This is evident in the fact that whenever Guts' malice synchronizes with the armor's OD, it closes its helm to resemble his inner beast of darkness, and only Shirke's luminous body has been shown to be even close to being helpful to him in that state. On the contrary, the Chapter 362 flashback we saw showed us that the previous wearer of the armor, aka Skull Knight, did manage to wield it with total mastery, as his eyes were still visible from his helm. Now you might say that this means nothing, but go ahead and read the chapters where Guts manages to use the armor whilst retaining his sanity, and the biggest difference is that his eyes become visible from the helm when he gains control. So, we think that the reason Gaiseric became known as the Skull King, the Demon King, and the King of Galloping Death was because he was fighting his wars with the Berserker armor on. In order to procure this armor, he must have traveled to Elfhelm at some point, because it seems like Hanar is not the type of dwarf to venture out of his forge. And this is where the Danon connection becomes important. It is noted by Guts and Shirke after witnessing Skull Knight's blood memory together that the Lady Priestess of Cherry Blossoms looked a lot like the Elven ruler of Elfhelm. Indeed, when Skull Knight pays a visit to his beloved's mausoleum, he shares a moment with Danon that might even be called tender, at least according to Berserk standards. The Flower Storm Monarch asks the Wandering Wraith whether he was here this time to visit the mausoleum of his past beloved, and the enigmatic struggler replies that he is a harbinger of calamity who is bound for only one place, and that place has no room for love or hate within it. Later, Guru Gedfring explains to an inquiring Guts and Shirke that Flora, Shirke's mistress, used to be one of the Lady Priestess's disciples, and the two of them were quite attached. But after the first eclipse, which caused the lady to be taken as a sacrifice, Flora violated a taboo that got her banished from Elfhelm altogether. This is why she lived in the Spirit Tree Mansion near Enoch Village when Guts and his party found her. But what exactly could this violation have been? Well, this is where Puck comes in. Remember what Puck says when he meets Skull Knight for the first time? He feels kind of like an elf. Now, that might just be because he is donning an armor made by Hanar, who resides on Elfhelm, which we know is possible because after wearing elven clothes, Casca, Shirke, and Farnes' ODs synchronize with that of the elves to an extent. But what if this is not because of his armor, but because of his state of being? Guru Gedfring compares Guts to Skull Knight, but Guts rejects the comparison, stating tenacity to be his true strong suit, unlike the wraith-like existence of Skull Knight. To this, the Guru replies that he might learn what being Skull Knight feels like at the moment of his death, because in that instance his fury would either consume him or breathe life into him like hellfire. This is very specific language that we think directly references how Gaiseric became Skull Knight. We know that as a former owner of the Berserker armor and having mastered it besides, Gaiseric must have used it to win countless battles in his day. After earning a fearsome reputation through his sheer savagery and use of magical allies, he then created the greatest capital city in the world. But the effects of the Berserker armor must have eaten away at his senses, which is why in his latter years he started craving them more and more. We know that Guts is already losing his sense of touch, sight, and taste. And what did Judo say Gaiseric's empire became before it crumbled? That's right, a den of feasting and pleasure. Losing sensory pleasure is enough to drive anyone into despair. Just look at Robot Man from Doom Patrol. But what really pissed Gaiseric off was a certain sage who tried to deny the existence of polytheistic gods in the view of Gaiseric's excesses, and decided that there must only be one single truth in all of creation. That sage, disillusioned by the king's debauchery, triggered a great sacrificial ceremony that ended up branding everyone Gaiseric held dear, including, we think, himself. Donning the Berserker armor once again, he fought through apostles to get to Void, but just as he did, his life ended within the armor, and at that moment, his rage transformed him into Skull Knight. Flora found him with the Lady Priestess's body in his arms after the interstice disappeared and performed elven magic to not only resurrect her mistress as Danon, but also bind Gaiseric's vengeful spirit to Hanar's armor. This would make Skull Knight more like the Wicker Men that attacked Guts' party on their arrival to Elfhelm, but would also be a taboo big enough for Flora to be banished from that place. The fact that Skull Knight trusted her to keep vigil over the Berserker armor shows that they were close when both of them led regular human lives. Perhaps they were war buddies. And if that is true, then Gaiseric must have come from Elfhelm itself. The details of how he got there and where he was born are irrelevant when you consider the fact that him being from Elfhelm explains his sudden appearance on the world stage and his successful unification campaign. Because even if people believed in magic more back then, non-believers will always exist alongside them. And we know from Shirke's initial contact with the human world how hostile mages can be to mankind. We think that Gaiseric, sensing a similar hostility engulfing the world, decided to do something about it himself. He then achieved it, but stagnating made him the very thing he hated. It was only in death he realized how foolish a king he had been. So, as a wandering wraith, he has now dedicated himself to the extinction of all inhumans, the source of his woes and the woes of everyone in Berserk at large. Insight into the flow of causality due to his ascended status also helps him a lot. There are some in the community who think that Zod is a manifestation of Gaiseric's inner beast of darkness, and that somehow him and the Skull Knight are two embodiments of the same entity, but this is impossible. The Berserker armor takes the shape of a person's beast of darkness, and Gaiseric seems to have clearly been a skull. In fact, we think the flashback panels Miura gives us of Gaiseric's visage are intentionally misleading because, as you know by now, we think he fought his wars with the Berserker armor. But that is about all we have to say about this topic. Marvelous verdict. So that's our full breakdown of who we think the Supreme King Gaiseric must have been in his old life and why he became what he did following his death. It cannot be stressed enough just how well Kentaro Miura used this foundational character from his series as an example of less is more. Gaiseric is mentioned by name 4 times in the story, and yet each time we find out so much about the world of Berserk that a single mention of his name becomes chum for a theorizing frenzy. His previous life is basically the dream that Griffith is chasing right now, and his current path in life is what Guts seems to have adopted. Which aspect of Gaiseric's life will prevail remains to be seen, as there is still no word on when Berserk will resume publication. But we hope that we find out more about this enigmatic King of Kings, because he sounds just like a Shakespearean tragic lead who can also Conan the Barbarian your ass in a minute. And that, my friends, is how you make a great character. That's it for our video, but if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, be safe out there, and thanks for watching.